welcome back to our podcast, NATO Through Time, where we're marking NATO's 75th anniversary this year by looking at some of the key moments over that very rich and long history which have shaped the NATO that we have today. Now, dear audience, as you also know, at least those of you who have followed the podcast thus far, what we like to do is to find special guests, important figures in that NATO history who are still able to share with us their experiences of what it was like to be there at the time, what their feelings were, what motivated them to take the decisions that they took, and basically looking back how they see the evolution of NATO and where it's going in the future. And when I say special guest, that certainly applies to the person that it is my privilege to be interviewing for the podcast today, Dr. Vaira Vīķe-Freiberga, who was President of Latvia for a long period from 1999 to 2007. And that meant that she was in office in April 2004 when the foreign ministers of 7 countries of Central and Eastern Europe came to NATO headquarters to accede to the North Atlantic Treaty, the so-called Big Bang enlargement. It was not the first enlargement of NATO after the Cold War. That was in 1999. But it was arguably the most significant because with 7 countries, it really turned NATO into a pan-European security organisation, projecting security and stability across the continent. So, Madam President, greetings today, and please say hello to our listeners.
Hello to everybody. Happy to be with you.
Thank you, Madam President. Well, you have had an extraordinary life. You were obliged to leave Latvia as a child, I understand. Everybody, I think, is aware that during the Second World War, Latvia, like the other Baltic states, where it was invaded twice, both by the Soviet Union and then by Hitler's Germany, and then obviously forced to live under the domination of the Soviet Union for the next 4 decades during the bitter divisions of the Cold War. So what I'd like to ask you first, on a more personal note, is what was it like as a child to have to leave your country?
Well, it's a long story, of course, because I left Riga on October 10, 1944, and 3 days later, Riga was taken by the Red Army. My parents had stayed on to the last, hoping for the war to end. My dad listened to the BBC, for which he could get actually a death penalty from the Gestapo. And he could see that the Allies were winning. And my parents were convinced that obviously once the war was over, the pre-war situation would be restored, and nations that had been like Latvia, members of the League of Nations, that their liberty would be restored, that they would recover their territorial integrity, and that the Red Army would be asked to withdraw beyond its borders. My parents had no clue, and nobody in Latvia had any idea that we had actually been sold down the drain by Mr. Churchill and Mr. Roosevelt in their meetings with Stalin in Yalta and in Tehran at these conferences. For all intents and purposes, we were written off by the Western powers in return for the help that the Soviet Union gave on the Eastern Front against Nazi Germany. So my parents' first idea was to flee from the front, then to flee from the Russians because they had experienced the occupation of 1940 to 41 with its mass deportations and other atrocities. So they did not want to live under a communist regime. And their aim was to flee as far west as the front was advancing and hope that after the war, they would be able to return home. My mother washed her curtains and put a clean tablecloth on the table and a Bible and said, well, everything will be clean when we come home. And if somebody else comes into this apartment, she seems to have an inkling that it might happen, they will realize that civilized people lived here, and she was, if you like, house proud of her apartment. So it was a long way. I could rattle off a series of places where we went. We kept moving west. We went to the coast of Latvia and Liepāja, then to Gottenhafen by boat, which was the city of the now Polish city of Gdynia. From there to Parchim in Mecklenburg, in a camp that seemed to have been a camp for either an extermination camp or something else. And we were living in sort of barn-like structures. My little sister died there. I was quite ill as well.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Went left to Schwerin, then to Wismar. Wismar was taken by the British forces in Mecklenburg, and my parents were relieved that were there at least would be saved from the Red Army. But then because luckily my dad befriended some British soldiers, and they told him they were moving out, and he couldn't believe why. And they said, well, we're handing over this territory to the Red Army. And of course, the soldiers had no idea why this has happened. None of the Latvian exiles had any idea why these vast tracts of territory occupied by the Western Allies were handed over to the Russians. We were in Mecklenburg. The Brits took it. They gave it to the Russians. My husband's family was in Thüringen, in southern eastern Germany. And the Americans took it at the end of the war, and they handed over to the Russian occupation zone. They never understood why. We were then in a camp in Herrenbeek, which is near Lübeck, then in camps in Lübeck, transit city of Paderborn, flying through München, and then going to a hydroelectric dam construction site on the Umerebja River in Morocco. And when that was finished, to Casablanca. And it's only from Casablanca that we, on our own steam, managed to get to Canada as immigrants in 1954.
My God, I had no idea that this took such a long time. My impression was that you would have got on a boat and arrived in Canada a couple of weeks later. Were you too young to experience that as a harrowing sort of experience, as real hardship, or were you old enough to sort of really, feel the discomfort, the uncertainty, the anxiety that your family must have felt as you went from one place to the other, not really knowing where you were going to end up?
Well, the worst part was the camp where my sister died because of the food was contaminated, the latrines were full, and this was the month of January and very cold. So that was a rather harrowing experience. Schwerin was equally harrowing because food was running low as the Russians were advancing and encircling the city. The experiences, if you like, were quite harrowing at certain times. And of course, the grief over my sister's death stayed with me for my whole life. Yeah. Hunger, cold, illness, pain, fear. The bombing in Wismar, we experienced the end of the war in Wismar, and there were daily overflights and almost daily bombings. Sometimes the planes just came, you could hear them coming, and then they would leave. But otherwise, other days, they start dropping bombs. Yeah. So, of course, I'd say sitting in a basement and hearing the bombs whistling down, and you have the feeling that they're falling right on your head. If you want to choose one moment, that is very difficult. I do not wish that on anybody.
Well, I can imagine, Madam President, we can talk about this in a moment, that obviously experiencing realpolitik, you mentioned Yalta, Potsdam, these territorial carve-ups of Europe by the great powers at the expense of small democratic nations. I imagine that perhaps that was one of the motivations to escape that kind of realpolitik that later on you sought in bringing your country into the NATO alliance. But this story, I think, is also very reflective of why NATO, precisely to stop that sort of thing happening to citizens of the democracies in the Atlantic area ever again. Just before we get to the more sort of NATO-related topics, when you were in Canada, what did you study? Did you see yourself as more Canadian or Latvian? Were you sort of existing in Canada but living in Latvia, which is the case with many people who perhaps feel themselves in exile? And did you sort of engage in politics at that time with a view that, well, maybe one day I will go home and I can play a role in rebuilding my country, putting it back together on its feet? Did you have a sense then that, becoming president of your country was something that you would aspire to? Or were these things very far from your mind as you were a teenager and a young adult and studying and starting your career and your family?
You see, in the refugee camps, for the 4 or 5 years that people spent in the refugee camps, they were separated in ethnic groups. And the Latvians desperately clung together with the idea that we were the only voice left that could tell the world about the injustice that had been done to our country.
Yeah.
Because you see, when during the first occupation by the Soviet Union, people were forced to go and vote and ask for Latvia being admitted to the Soviet Union. My mother, I remember sitting on her lap as a 3-year-old child, and a man in uniform with a pistol in at his belt asked her whether she'd been to vote in the referendum. And she said, no, I have a small child and I'm not going to the referendum. And he says, oh, yes, citizen, you are going to vote in the referendum and come with me. So Latvians had seen what the Soviet Union meant. When the United Nations said, well, that's enough of feeding these refugees in Germany, they have to emigrate to countries, whoever are ready to take them. The groups that formed in the countries that did take up refugees wanted to stick together and to keep the if you like, the ideology alive that we are political exiles and it's our duty to remind the world of the injustice done to our country. Well, I arrived in Canada. I was 16 years old. I had taken all the preparations for getting over were actually in my hand. And when we arrived, it was fall. And I said to my parents, I think I better go and look for a high school. I should register because I'd done 4 years of high school in Casablanca. Yeah. And my mother said to me, no, you will not be going back to school. We want you to take a job. And I said, what on earth for? My whole idea was to get as high an education as I possibly could. Because I was the best student, not just in my class, but in the whole school. So why would I be taken out of school? Well, they said we borrowed money for the trip over. We had to pay for it ourselves. And it's a long way from Casablanca to Toronto. And they said we borrowed money from our friends here in Canada. We had shared the same room in our DP camp, you see, so they became friends for life. Yeah. You either become enemies for life or friends for life. So we were lucky. And she said, well, I feel embarrassed at owing money to somebody. I find it's sort of somehow shameful to have borrowed money. I'd like to return our debt as soon as we could. And that's why you have to go to look for a job. So I went to the unemployment office and started going to interviews. And everybody would ask me, do you have experience? There's a skinny 16-year-old sitting in front of them with her high school English that I learned in the French school. And they asked me if I have experience. And then I think the Commerce Bank of Canada gave me a job as a teller at the minimum wage, and they cheated me because they said they would raise my salary after 6 months if I performed well. Yeah. I did perform well, but they didn't. They said, "Oh, well, wait till you have worked a year with us, and then we'll give you a higher raise than we will give you now." Yeah. Of course, my intention was to get into university as quickly as I could. So I took night courses, I took correspondence courses, I improvised, and I entered U of T at the age of 17 when my average classmates were 18 to 19 years old. Yeah. I sort of overdid it.
You've always been known as being a strong-willed character, and so resilience, coping with hardship, also maybe discrimination. perhaps, of course, at the time, because you were a woman, this was a different age than the one we live in now. Probably that sort of hardened you, which perhaps was useful in political life and state responsibilities later on.
Well, I spent my life doing, as many exile Latvians did, living in a way a double life, a local Canadian or even international life, and then our Latvian society, which was worldwide. My specialty became sort of organizing summer camps for youngsters of Latvian origin, of university age, to tell them we would rent a camp and as it were, teach them all things Latvian, improve their Latvian language, knowledge of history, literature, tell them about the musicians that Latvia has produced and so on. And I taught my children Latvian, although we lived in a bilingual city, Montreal, which is French and English, and they went to French schools and English schools, but they also went to Saturday school in Latvian. I taught Saturdays in a Saturday school. I taught in these camps, which we called 2 by 2, like basic arithmetic. I became a speaker at every 18th of November, the day of independence of Latvia. Latvian communities everywhere would celebrate with a special occasion. And I became an invited speaker all across Canada, the United States. We had the youth camps in Brazil, in Venezuela. In Australia, I toured Australia as a speaker in Latvian events, so that there was a world community of those Latvians who remained faithful to the original ideological commitment to Latvia, which must be free again, and we must spend our lives working towards preserving Latvian language, culture, and the memory of our independence, with the idea of one day seeing it come back. On the 50th anniversary of Latvia's independence in 1968, I made a speech in Montreal in English, and I said, the Soviet Union is going to collapse one day. Sadly, we do not know when that day will come, but it is inevitable. It will collapse of its own weaknesses, and it did.
In 1989, the Berlin Wall finally comes down. The Soviet Union collapses a couple of years later on. It's the end of the Warsaw Pact. It's the end of the division of Europe. Latvia becomes, together with Lithuania and Estonia, once again an independent sovereign country. And of course, yes, the Baltic Way human chain, where people joined up across the Baltic states in a show of support for independence at that time. What was it like witnessing all of that?
I was in Canada at the time of the Baltic Way, when people from 3 countries, from Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, literally joined hands all across the 3 countries. It was a peaceful demonstration for 3 nations that were asking to recover their independence and wanted to secede from the Soviet Union. I was at that time in Canada, but of course we were all riveted by it, and I only wished I could have been and participated in it. The Berlin Wall, the whole world saw that on television, and certainly every exiled Latvian was glued to their television screen, and I think the greatest happiness was when they started dismantling that wall and climbing over it. We felt that our turn would come surely soon as well, and something similar to the breaking down of the, breaking through the Iron Curtain would happen, and we could be able to return to a free Latvia.
Madam President, what our listeners also would love to hear from you is why you chose to return to Latvia in 1998, having been away for the best part of half a century. And can you just in a few words say something about how you became president? As I said, was this something that happened sort of all of a sudden, or was this something that you'd been sort of carefully preparing for, precisely with the ambition to lead your country?
I have never been member of a political party, and I'm not either now, since I stood as an independent. But the coalition that had chosen me in the second turn of elections, the first pass, there were 5 parties presenting candidates, and each party voted only for its own candidate and none other, so nobody got elected. Then there was a second pass, and I was one of 3 candidates, and I was supported by the left, the center, and the right-wing party, so the whole spectrum. So I was rather proud of that. But of course, there was never a campaign as such. I never spent a cent. It was just, if you might say, a popular movement, because there was a letter signed by, I think, 59 academicians and intellectuals in Latvia, published in a newspaper, asking the president, because we're a parliamentary republic, you see, it's the parliament that does the electing. And the parliament had many people lobbying on my behalf. And in fact, a year earlier, I had been approached by 2 poets. You see, we're a country where poets have a political influence, if you like, and they had approached already parties in power, in sitting in the parliament and in the government, with the idea that should their candidates chosen by their parties not get elected, that here was a candidate from abroad that should be seriously looked at. And it so happened that my university gave me early retirement when I was 60 years old, and there I was, all dressed up and ready to go.
So clearly, yes, you were a Latvian leader. Before you went home, you'd already developed a profile, a reputation as a defender of your country's interests and rights. You'd become well known internationally. Once you became president, how did you look upon the NATO alliance? Was that something where you felt, from your first day in office, this is where the country has got to go? But when you looked to NATO accession, did you see the process as something that went quite smoothly, or was it complicated? Were there bumps in the road?
Well, I should maybe interject at this point the fact that I have a double link to NATO. In 1979, I was appointed by the Canadian government to go and represent Canada in the scientific program of NATO.
Right.
And for 3 years, I traveled twice a year to Brussels to the meetings of a special panel on human factors. I chaired it at one point, and I sat at the table where there were 15 member countries, and I sat there with the Canadian flag in front of me. I had the right, as somebody born in Latvia and lived in Canada, to have a double citizenship. But the law was passed a few weeks before my election, whereby candidates as well had to give up their passport. So I gave up my passport a few days before the second round of elections, when I was proposed as candidate. Canada took back my passport with the assurance that I could get it back anytime I so desired. And then I became, of course, a very active lobbyist for the enlargement of NATO, because I always felt the first thing first is to convince the then member countries it is crucially important to enlarge NATO, to include the former communist countries that now wish to be part of the Western alliance and of Western civilization. And of course, concretely, specifically, my own country, I was an extremely active lobbyist. It was hard work, definitely, because we were told it's not just a question of you're getting ready with a membership action plan, which of course, that goes without saying, had to be fulfilled. Yeah. But politically, that it would be a political vote and a political decision by the member countries, because there are these 2 aspects, military readiness and political readiness as well.
If I may ask you why you felt it was important that Latvia should join NATO and would be, if you like, less secure if it remained outside the alliance?
With the history that we have and that the whole region has, it's very clear that we, precisely because we're a small country and precisely of our geographical location, we happen to live in a bad neighborhood. If it's not one side, it's the other. In 1940, in the 40s, it was both sides who were attacking us. We are not, Latvia tried to be neutral between the 2 world wars. It didn't help it one little bit. Neither did it help anybody else, except for those who happen to be geographically able to stand aside from the conflict. It was evident to me from history that we could not possibly defend ourselves in the modern world if anybody should attack us. That we did, and since there was this alliance, this collective defense alliance ready. As I knew it as a Canadian, I knew about it. Yeah. It seemed to me the only way of being sure and secure in our independence and maintaining it would be to join an alliance. I could see we alone couldn't possibly do what the Ukrainians are doing now. We're too small.
Yeah. And was there a political consensus in Latvia on NATO membership? Was public opinion very much in favour? Or did you sort of have to get out there on the stump and with all your talent for giving speeches and make the case? Or did you feel that you had a tidal wave of public support behind you?
The public support was high. And considering that we do have also a Russian minority who clearly would be sympathizing with Moscow rather than with Brussels or anywhere else, the support for NATO was quite high, and so that my efforts on behalf of us joining were directed outside in other countries. It's for the European Union that I had to militate inside the country and convince them that that was a smart thing to do as well.
Although you did join the EU just a few weeks after you joined NATO, so you were successful on that front. Madam President, as I've said, you have had an extraordinary life, and every answer you give proves that you've had an extraordinary life. I doubt that there are many presidents of, or past presidents of NATO member states who sat on a NATO Science and Technology Committee during the Cold War under a different passport. But certainly that gave you a sneak preview of the alliance that very, very few other candidate countries joining would have had. But Latvia, if you will forgive me for saying this, is a small country. NATO has many big countries, of course, the United States, but others in as well. And sometimes you hear the view that, you know, the alliance is sort of dominated by the big countries and the small countries don't really have much of a voice. Having sort of experienced the accession process, you were also, of course, president for the first 3 years or so when Latvia was a NATO member state. Do you sort of feel that NATO really does give you a voice in shaping European security issues, that it stands up for your interests, is receptive to the way you look upon the world? Do you think that Latvia has done a good job shaping NATO decisions in a way that you feel meets those security interests? I think our listeners would be interested to sort of get your perception of, you know, what NATO has done for Latvia, but of course, just as importantly, what you think your country has done for NATO since, in the last 20 years that you've been a member.
Well, I think I tried to give a sense of that in a speech I gave at the summit of Prague when it was officially announced which countries would be part of the enlargement. I tried to tell the then members, in fact, I congratulated them on having made a wise decision.
For us in Latvia, it comes as a sign of international justice. It will put an end, for once and for all, to the last vestiges of the Second World War, to the consequences of the decisions taken in Tehran and in Yalta. Latvia lost its independence for a very long time, and it knows the meaning both of liberty and the loss of it. You have taken the plunge, and you have put your faith in us, and you have been guiding us and helping us along the path of reform that we have undertaken. We in Latvia would like to build our future on the rock of political certainty, not on the shifting sands of indecision. We do not want to be in some sort of gray zone of political uncertainty. We would like to enjoy the full sunshine of the liberties and the rights that NATO has been defending so long. We do not want to be left out in the outer darkness, and we would not wish this to happen to any other nation. who has expressed the desire to join those nations that hold the same values, that follow the same ideals, and that are ready for the same efforts and the same strivings.
Of course, my country is what I defended. Latvia was my first interest. But we have neighbors who have had the same history. And I saw a vision of a Europe precisely as the American president had said, whole and free, of which we would be part, and contributing to its security, contributing to its culture, contributing to it as a collectivity of human beings. When I think of we are a small country, but you'd be amazed at the international success that Latvian conductors, Latvian opera singers, all sorts of Latvians have achieved in various sports. We have gold medalists. We have amazing achievements for what would be maybe a country that is the size of maybe a suburb of some megacity somewhere else in a different country. I can tell your listeners that we, as a small country, and one that's still after all these years is recovering from 50 years of Soviet rule, we are boosting up our investment in our own defense up to 3%, so that nobody can complain that we are not pulling our weight. And we have been ever since we were candidate countries, we have sent our missions, very competent missions to the various places where NATO had missions occurring. And also the case is the same for the other those countries that were accepted in the Big Bang. NATO remains a crucial, I think, as a whole, collective security assurance. And while we can count on Canada as a very solid, and we're particularly grateful because Canada has a special role in the advanced presence of troops, NATO troops.
I wanted to ask you about that, yes, because as you rightly say, Canada heads the NATO multinational battalion in Latvia. Did you have anything to do with that, given all of your very strong ties with Canada, or was it pure coincidence?
In all fairness, this happened after my presidency, so that I had no official role anymore.
But they must have thought that is the land of President Vike-Freiberga, where we feel very, very, very much at home and very welcome, particularly, of course, having played host, as you said, to such an important Latvian diaspora after 1945. Are there particular issues that a Latvian ambassador on the North Atlantic Council would be pushing as being, the core issues from a Latvian perspective?
Particularly, the emphasis has been on having a defense plan for the eastern flank of the NATO alliance. There was a time when we joined in 2004 when countries like Germany were reluctant that there should be a NATO plan of how to defend the Baltics should they be attacked, because the Russian president might feel offended that a plan was being presented or planned possibly against him. And it took some, I think, work on behalf of Latvian representatives, but also our neighbors as well, to convince the other NATO members that there must be a plan for defending the eastern flank of NATO in Europe, a well-thought-out plan that sees all contingencies and includes them in the plan. I see things on YouTube where so-called experts are predicting how our countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, will be cut off from the rest of NATO and left, you see, to be swallowed up by Russia in a very short time. They even forget that there's the island now, the Swedish island in the middle of the Baltic Sea, which becomes a defense point, and the geostrategic situation is completely changed, mercifully, with Sweden and Finland having joined.
And I hope, Madam President, that you see all those outside your window occasionally, all of those NATO troops coming past on exercises to implement the Supreme Allied Commander's regional defence plans, which demonstrate that NATO has the resolve and the capability to definitely make sure that every inch of your country and your fellow Baltic states will be defended. I imagine that although you're not president of your country any longer, you can't be president forever. That only happens in authoritarian states, as we well know. You probably still sort of take an interest in what's going on here in Brussels at NATO. How do you see the alliance today? And are there things that concern you about the challenges, all of them, that NATO is facing today? For example, some people are question the vitality of the transatlantic relationship. I know that, not only because you were formerly a Canadian citizen, you are a very committed transatlanticist. Are you worried about the strength of the transatlantic link? As we turn a bit from the past as we close to the future, how do you see the future of the alliance?
Well, I must say that the United States, of course, is going to play a crucial role, and the elections that are coming up in the month of November are going to be a turning point, either a strengthening of the alliance or a weakening of it. And of course, I devoutly hope that it will mean a strengthening.
Again, it's been a great pleasure for me. I've learned an enormous amount today. It's sobering, to be frank with you, to hear about the experiences of previous generations who lived in far worse times than it's been my privilege to have lived in the latter half of the 20th century. I've had a life in NATO. You had a life before NATO and a life since NATO. But I'm sure everybody will be absolutely riveted by what you've told us today. Thanks again for being so generous with your time, your intellect, your experience, and again, best wishes to you and best wishes to Latvia.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, dear listeners, like me, I hope you very much enjoyed the conversation with President Vike-Freiberga. She certainly refers back to a dark period in European history where nations didn't have any security, but individuals didn't have any security either, being pushed from country to country, continent to continent, to find new homes after the tragedy of the Second World War. And sometimes, perhaps in making the case for NATO, looking back to the situation before NATO existed, it is maybe perhaps the best line of reasoning that we could find. And President Vike-Freiberga has certainly been a witness to all of that, which she shared with us today. That's all for today. Thank you again for joining us, and hopefully you will tune back in very soon. Bye for now.